Hello, gathered friends, I'm Roar Nuva, and welcome to Bionicle Deep Dive, where we analyze the tropes, characters, and lore of LEGO Bionicle. In this video, I wanted to take a look at what I believe are some of the story-based reasons why the 2015 reboot, also known as Bionicle Generation 2, underperformed and was cancelled after just 2 years. This is part 2 in my 3-part series talking about the story-based reasons why the previous generations of Bionicle had to discontinue, and what could have been done to avoid those pitfalls. In part 1, I looked at how Generation 1's lack of easy accessibility led to its decline. In part 2, I'm going to show why I believe that the reason G2 didn't take off was that the story and the advertising for the story failed to communicate to newer fans why they should get invested, and that there were specific choices made that undermined its potential allure. Let's dive right into it. While the exact details of how G2 performed and why it was cancelled were never explicitly stated, it is known that it was cancelled primarily due to poor toy sales. And considering how quickly it was cancelled, it's very likely that the early waves of G2 actually sold terribly. It was pretty clear based on both LEGO's trends with its themes at the time, as well as the direction G2's story was going, that Bionicle's reboot was planned to be a 3-year run, at least initially. Given how far in advance LEGO has to plan to make new toys, the sales data that they had to have used to decide to cancel must have come from those first waves in 2015. But, so, why weren't enough people buying sets early on? After all, it generated tremendous amounts of hype from the old fans who were extremely dedicated. And, if I'm being honest, I thought the toys looked amazing. See, the problem is, Bionicle G2 fundamentally could not rely solely on old fans to carry them through. The core group of Bionicle superfans, while passionate, simply wasn't large enough to sustain the line without massive support from newer and more casual fans, much like with G1. And the timing of the release of G2 also didn't help. If you think about it, 5 years after the original ended is actually a really short time to bring a series back. They were working on G2 all the way back in 2013, so they essentially jumped right back on not long after it ended. But what that meant is that by 2015, most of the original fans were in their late teens and early 20s, which is probably one of the worst demographics for LEGO to market to. Many of them were considered too old to ask their parents to buy them toys, but were also not established enough in jobs or careers to be able to afford toys for themselves, especially given how much more expensive these sets were and how stagnated wages had become. No, there needed to be a fresh influx of newer fans, kids who really wanted these toys and parents who were willing to buy them. And while the sets were very cool on their own, they weren't enough to seal the deal, especially again with how much the market had changed since 2001. The sets were way more expensive, meaning that they had to really want these toys for their parents to shell out. LEGO also had other popular themes in its lineup that Bionicle was competing with, compared to 2001 where Bionicle was one of the biggest things going on for LEGO. And of course, all physical toys are having to compete hard with iPads, video games, and the internet, so in order to break through, Bionicle would need to have a really strong hook. Now, I've always believed that the biggest hook for Bionicle was the story, and the world that came with these characters. So, in order to get the kids interested, they needed to know the story, feel connected to the characters in the setting, and become invested in trying to solve the mysteries. And if G2 failed so dramatically early on, I believe that meant that the story early on failed to be captivating. And that's why for this video, I'm mainly going to be focusing on aspects of the very early story material, such as the 2015 animations and the website, and how they were written and presented in ways that failed to get passing audiences invested. I have plenty of other thoughts on G2, both positive and negative, that aren't as relevant for this video, so I'll save them for a future one down the line. Now, there have been a lot of debated reasons as to why G2 was cancelled, beyond just the story. However, I'm mainly going to be focusing on those story-based reasons, since that's what I'm good at. I'm not going to be looking extensively at things like the ins and outs of the changing toy market, LEGO's internal business structure, or the quality of the sets, all of which can be argued to be very important factors. So take what I say here with some skepticism. I'll admit myself it's an incomplete picture. However, I'm very good at analyzing stories, and I believe that how the story of Bionicle G2 was handled by LEGO was a critical factor in its failure. Ultimately, it can be broken down into two problems: the marketing being lukewarm, and the story itself just not being as gripping as the original. And in both cases, I think the problem was the same. While G2 was very cool looking and had a lot of the surface level aspects of Bionicle, they failed to communicate the depth that was the real hook for the series. In their attempt to not make the same mistakes as last time, they tried to simplify it and make it less complex. But in doing so, they also removed a lot of the depth that made Bionicle stand out and be alluring. Now, I want to draw an important distinction between complexity and depth, because I believe that they are different things, but both LEGO and the Bionicle community have at times conflated them. So, the complexity of a story is the things like the number of characters and locations, the sheer number of plot events that happened, the amount of special terms, and all the different factions that a fan would have to catch up on. These are the things that can leave a potential new fan feeling overwhelmed, and like the old fans are a closed club of nerds speaking their own language. Too much complexity begins to make a story inaccessible. On the other hand, the depth of a story is the themes, the character development, the mysteries, the aspects of the story that get you really thinking about it and wanting to hear more. Depth is what gets people to like a story more than casually, and creates the really invested medium fans and super fans that can fuel a series like this for years. You can have a very simple story that's profound and deep and connects well with people. You can also have a story that's very complex with lots of info and lore, but is really kind of shallow when it comes to the actual characters and themes, and leave people feeling like they aren't worth getting invested in. Finding the right balance between the two is the key to good storytelling. For the most part, the depth and complexity of a story are usually intertwined. Adding more depth often means adding more complexity. In addition, sometimes complexity can add depth on its own simply by creating a rich and filled-in world to explore. G1 did this a lot. But the important thing is that if the audience is invested, they will be willing to put in the mental effort for the complexity because it will be worth it. And investment requires that they see the depth and connect with it. Something that's often cited as the reason for G1 not doing as well in its later years was that the story and the lore were getting too complex, and that made it difficult to follow for people who weren't always invested. In addition, the story was made inherently more complex by how spread out it was across different mediums. But the depth was always there. The sense of mystery, the richness in the world building, and the compelling characters were always present, and that's what made the fans who were invested love it till the end and want it back to this day. Generation 1 was both deep and complex. It had the depth that drew people in, that made the fans and who kept with the series become devoted, but it had the excessive complexity that made it harder for new fans to get into it. G2, on the other hand, was neither complex nor deep. Or at least the depth that was there was not explored in consistently captivating ways. So first, let's look at the marketing of G2, which I think was very, very important. Now, as far as the amount of advertising, it really wasn't great. We did see commercials, and there were the online animations, which were fairly prominent on the LEGO website and YouTube channel. However, it definitely could have been advertised way more aggressively. And in particular, there could have been significantly more story content produced and pushed to the forefront. That essentially would have acted as advertising for the toys. The real bulk of the story for the 2015 arc was told in the 2015 animations. And, I actually really loved those animations. I think they utilized the format extremely well. They were fun, colorful, exciting, and offered great snippets of the world and the characters. The problem was that there just wasn't enough. They were good for a surface telling of the story, and initially that's what I thought they were. A well-done set of teasers for a deep dive later. And they definitely suggested more depth to the world, which was a good thing. But there ended up being not much else, which means that quick breeze through of the plot was all we got. I can imagine being a kid and seeing those and being really intrigued by Bionicle, but then coming in and seeing that there really wasn't much else there, so wouldn't be as invested despite them looking kind of cool. At this point in its run, G1 had the Matanui Online game, as well as the comics, both of which provided rich storytelling of the world and characters. Now, what's even worse is that there actually was additional story content, like the books and the graphic novels for G2, which were good, but those story pieces were barely advertised at all. The only reason I and many of the other OG fans even knew about them was because we were actively looking for them and were told by other old fans. I have no idea how a new Bionicle kid would have found them, and I imagine very few did. And that means despite their effort to make it simpler, it was still inaccessible, which is the worst of both worlds. So, when talking about the story content that was supposed to provide the hook, we really can't include the books or the graphic novels. This means that it still had the core problem that made G1 decline, a story that was hard to get into. But this time, it was due to a lack of material rather than an overabundance. Ultimately, LEGO put out a very small amount of content for G2's early arcs, and while that got many of the dedicated older fans hyped, there were times where it felt like LEGO was relying on that old fan hype to carry them through, rather than generating new hype on their own, and that half-heartedness cost them dearly. Later in the next year, they made the Netflix TV series Journey to One, which was a good idea, but far too late to bring in enough sales. Perhaps if they had made a series like that early on, it would have given it more runtime and room to breathe, there would have been a stronger audience early on. But those are the problems with how the story was presented and advertised. Next, let's look at the story itself, because I feel like there were several key ways that the story stumbled in its execution that made new people less willing to get invested. And if the story is not well executed, the toys won't sell well. Now, I want to be clear that I'm mainly criticizing the execution. The actual concepts and creativity in the story I found very interesting. The problems with G2's story can be broken down into three main issues, and I'll go through each of them in detail. Each of these problems, while not necessarily present throughout all of G2, were very present in the earliest and most accessible material, like the promotions and the 2015 animations. So, for the series to go down as quickly as it did, these initial hooks had to have been the main failure point for the story. Number 1. The characters and the setting were initially underdeveloped, leaving the world feeling flat. Number 2. The central conflict and motivations of the villains were poorly communicated, leaving the stakes and direction of the story unclear. And 3. There was very little actual mystery for the audience to solve. Now, I could certainly argue that there were more issues with the G2 story, but these were the main issues related to audience investment in the very early story material, which is the focus of this video. So, with characters and setting being underdeveloped, this is actually an area where it's more mixed than totally bad. While there certainly could have been more depth added to the TOA, for the most part, I'd actually say that they were pretty decently written for the series as it was. Again, they weren't quite as deep as their G1 incarnations, but all the TOA had distinct, quirky personalities, and each had moments to shine, and I found them genuinely enjoyable and compelling. The lack of development comes more from the side characters, and for the world of Akoto as a whole. There was little to no development of any of the characters besides the TOA. One of G1's strengths was its rich ensemble cast of side characters, who made the villages and the world feel rich and populated. Particularly, this was the strength of the Matsunui Online game, where you played as Takua and explored the island. Generation 2 didn't really have that. The Protectors weren't even given names or unique character blurbs on the website, despite being significant side characters. Only the Protector of Fire had any lines in the animation, and there was only a limited amount of personality in them. None of the villagers were anything more than background characters, and the actual villages themselves were barely shown for more than a few seconds. They were given some more development in the books and graphic novels, but again, those came out later in the year and were barely advertised, so they couldn't act as a hook. Essentially, there was no mechanism for the audience to explore this vast world, which ended up making it feel empty and flat. Now, my second big point on the story is that the conflict and stakes were poorly communicated. And they were kind of vague and even a little inconsistent. Stories are driven by the conflicts and motivations of the characters. If it's unclear what their goals are or why they're doing what they do, it's difficult to get invested. In G1, especially in the beginning, the conflict was very clear. The dark spirit Makuta controls the island, terrorizes the villagers with his beasts, and seeks to keep the Great Spirit asleep forever. Why did Makuta do what he did? He was jealous of the Great Spirit and wanted the islanders to worship him instead. The Toa, the heroes, have come to free the island and awaken the Great Spirit, and to do that, they have to find the Masks of Power and defeat Makuta. Clear conflict, clear stakes, clear motivations and actions on both sides so the audience can jump right in and get invested. While there was tons of mystery surrounding everything else, the actual driving conflict was well established and easy to understand. G1 may have gotten less clear with its conflict later on due to the complexity, but at least at first, they were clear enough to draw people in. In G2, on the other hand, things were smoothed over in a way that made them feel vague. The Toa said that evil was rising and that they were here to battle evil. To fulfill their quest, they had to find the Mask of Power and Ikimu the Mask Maker. So, it was pretty straightforward on their side, but what were the motivations and goals of the villains? That was kind of unclear. What was the evil the Toa had to fight? We saw skull spiders everywhere, but they were hardly threatening enough to feel like a real rising evil on their own. They were searching for the Mask of Power, but it wasn't clear in the animations what they were doing to the villagers, or what their goal or purpose was that was driving them to seek the masks. But the story also didn't treat it like a mystery to solve, so when they did reveal what was happening, it didn't feel like it had impact. And then in the next wave, you had the Skull villains, who were infamously underwhelming, and while a lot of people criticize their designs, which I do too, they were also incredibly underwhelming as characters and as antagonists. It was never clear what they wanted to do. Just a vague, opposing the Toa, but it wasn't even super clear why or what they were doing. So it was incredibly difficult to get invested in them. And with that lack of investment, it was going to be even harder to look past some of the incompleteness looking of the toys. Now, the thing that I think really epitomizes the haphazard handling of the villain's motivation was in the recap episode of the animations. And how a series of less than 20 90-second videos could have possibly needed a recap episode is absurd, but I digress. While the Toa are all listing off the things we already know, Pohatu casually says that the Skull Spiders were under evil Makuta's control, as if that's a thing that had been established. Who the Skull Spiders were working for had never been established before that point, and yet the Toa all knew this important plot detail, even though the audience didn't. Now, of course, I could see the writing on the wall that Makuta was probably behind the Skull Spiders right from the beginning. It wasn't hard to figure out. Makuta's behind everything, that's how Bionicle works. I was an older fan and I knew what to look out for. But the kids who were just starting the series might not know that. The fact that at first the story never made an explicit connection between Makuta in the legend and the Skull Spiders in the present made it seem like they were separate entities, and the fact that they were working for Makuta could have been made into a nice twist reveal that he was coming back. But to just throw out that Makuta was involved in a way that had no dramatic weight, as if it was obvious, cemented that the series really had no idea how to handle its villains and conflict, and how to make, these dramatic story beats to hook people in. If Makuta coming back was a reveal, that could have been a very powerful moment. And then even after it was revealed, it was never established why Makuta wanted the Skull villains to do what they did. Skull Grinder eventually wanted to destroy the Mask of Creation, but it wasn't clear what that would do. And the biggest problem is that these ambiguous plot points were never treated like mysteries by the narrative. And that leads to the third main drawback of the story, that there was very little mystery. Mystery being the thing that was the driving interest in G1. Almost everything that the story team gave focus on in G2 was spelled out outright, and almost everything that was ambiguous felt brushed over. There was very little of importance that the audience felt the need to puzzle over and solve. While there were plenty of things that were unclear, there was never any indication that there was an underlying consistency to connect it all, making the things that were unclear feel like inconsistencies rather than hints. One of the best ways to create depth in a series is to establish mystery, things that the audience has to think about and get invested in solving. Things that are unclear that are deliberately set up to be mysteries for the audience can be great tension builders. Take the Bulrock from G1. Their goal was to destroy the island of Matanui, and at the time, we didn't know why. But that was purposely framed as a mystery, which made them all the more intriguing. The fact that the toy didn't know what was happening was an explicit plot point. The protagonists, and therefore the audience, had to work to find out the truth. That work to solve a mystery is great for getting people involved. But when it's ambiguous, but then the answer is just thrown out like it was never a mystery, that just feels like poor writing, and that the series is all over the place, which doesn't make people want to pour their time and mental energy into it. And therefore, they don't want to pour their money into the toys. And of course, G2 lacked the central core mystery that G1 had. There was no big story engine, as the writers of G1 would call it. I am of course referring to the reveal in G1 that the Great Spirit was in fact a gigantic sleeping robot underneath the island. Almost the entire G1 story and world were built around that premise, and from its aesthetics to its themes. All the various mysteries and contradictions were pointing towards that reveal. Now, I'm not saying that G2 necessarily had to have that specific plot twist, though I do think a giant robot's body would have been a good idea for it to play with. This is, after all, Biological Chronicle. But the fact that there was no other form of unifying plot thread that drove the story and the mystery really hurt how the story was presented, especially early on. There was nothing hidden about the island, and that felt clear to even casual audiences. Nothing to really draw people in. In many ways, the island of Akoto is a perfect metaphor for G2 as a whole. It had cool aesthetic features of the original, but there was nothing beneath the surface. And it's so sad because there was clearly a lot of creativity and implied depth in the concepts that were made for the story. Just one glance at the Bionicle Generation 2 art book will tell you that the people making G2 put immense amounts of thought and effort into it. They clearly wanted there to be the depth in the characters in the world of Okoto. But it's like the story team came up with concepts, but then just dropped them. They didn't finish the thought, and that left the series feeling shallow because so little of it was explored. Sometimes I genuinely wonder if the story team was told to stop and move on before they developed a plot point too much, because LEGO was afraid of making it too complex. Everything about G2 felt half-baked, and that was clear to everyone who saw it, including the newer kids, I believe. G1's story succeeded so well because it deeply respected the intelligence of the kids who read it, and trusted them to appreciate its depth. G2 simply didn't give nearly the amount of depth or the time to the story. And the parts that actually had depth were not promoted enough to actually reach their audience. For anyone who didn't already know how good Bionicle could be, I imagine it would be very easy to see it as kinda cool, but also not enough to dive deep into, and move on to something else. And I believe that ultimately it was that lack of investment early on that led to a lack of toy sales, and the rushed cancellation of the theme after only 2 years. Those are my thoughts on how Generation 2's lack of proper story communication led to its decline. This video was mostly negative because it focused on what led to G2's ending, but I actually don't hate G2. I really loved most of what was there. It's just what wasn't there that left me disappointed. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with me that that's what led to poor investment from newer fans? Or do you believe that other factors played a more important role? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And join me next week for part 3, where I give my thoughts on whether or not a future Bionicle series could happen, and what it would need to do to avoid the mistakes of the past, as well as what we fans can do and have been doing to keep the spirit of Bionicle alive. Until then, take care, my gathered friends.